So I'm going to turn next to Plymouth. There is one additional document relevant to Lewisham, which I want to come to, but we're making arrangements for it to be available for display. So once that is available, I will share it at a convenient moment. So in relation to Plymouth, the evidence we have suggests that there was no physical haemophilia centre as such at Plymouth. Haemophilia care was provided at the haematology department at the District General Hospital and then at a later stage in the 80s to the Derriford Hospital. If we go to HSOC 002961_003, these are the minutes of a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Haemophilia Society in June 72. If we go to the second page, we can see the early origins of a centre in Plymouth. If we look at the heading Honorary Secretary's Report, it says Professor J.L. Stafford will be leaving St George's Hospital in the autumn. His successor as Director of the Haemophilia Centre at St George's Tooting is not yet known. Professor Stafford is inter alia to be Director of the Blood Transfusion Sub-Centre in Plymouth. Mrs. Britton told him that there's no organised treatment for haemophiliacs between Exeter Centre and Truro, which is not an official centre, and asked him if he would start something in Plymouth. He says he will study the situation on arrival and will help as best I can. And then, if we pick it up in 1976, at CBLA 40391, these are the minutes of a meeting in July 1976 of Blood Transfusion Centre Directors, Regional Scientific, if we go to, yes, Regional Scientific Advisors and Haemophilia Centre Directors. Sorry, the heading appears more usefully on page 5. But if we go over the page in any event to page 7, we can see the discussion about Plymouth. Bottom of the page, Dr. Mills and Dr. Edgecombe spoke about the southwest region and considered that associate centres or haemophilia centres should be set up at Plymouth, Taunton, Truro, Torbay and Barnstaple. It was emphasised that doctors interested to organise centres worked at these hospitals, that patients were in fact treated at these hospitals, and that many summer visitors came to the area. In the summer, the roads in the southwest are congested, and travelling long distances to the haemophilia centre at Exeter could be very time-consuming. If the centres were listed, then patients would know where to go. Dr. Smith said, and then he refers then to the supply of cryoprecipitate there from the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre, and the discussion continues. So we can see there the ongoing discussions in relating to the creation of a formal centre in Plymouth. That had happened certainly, I think, by 1977. Dr. Greenber and Dr. Stafford are identified as the centre's directors in a document from January 1977. Dr. Greenber retired in 1981, and there are UK HCDO minutes which identify them as co-directors. Dr. Prentice then became the co-director with Dr. Stafford in 1982, and he remained there until he moved to a hospital in London in 2006. We do have a statement from Dr. Prentice, and I shall refer to some specific extracts from that statement shortly. In terms of the facilities at Plymouth, from Dr. Prentice's perspective, and describing the picture, therefore, in the early 80s, he said that there were no haemophilia clinics run and very few patients in Plymouth. He describes the facilities as follows. Patients came up initially to the porter cabin outside the laboratory, an old converted police station, and the laboratory would call me to see the patients when they had arrived with bleeds. Sometimes they would call my secretary, and the calls to me would come through her. A clinical unit within the hospital was established in 1986, in which patients were subsequently seen. If we then look in terms of the supply of products to Plymouth, at NHBT 0006268_002, we look at the introduction to this document at the top half of the page. The South Western Regional Transfusion Centre has its headquarters at Bristol on the Southmead Hospital site. This sub-centre and blood bank is at Plymouth General Hospital. This sub-centre works closely with the Bristol Regional Centre and has a direct computer terminal link. There are 2 donor collection teams working from Plymouth, but their work is controlled and scheduled from the Bristol Regional Transfusion Centre. So the Bristol Transfusion Centre supplied products to Plymouth, but there was this sub-centre of the Bristol Transfusion Centre actually located in Plymouth, along with a blood bank. In terms of treatment, ability to purchase treatments and issues around shortage and supply, there is at TREL 40142_025 a snapshot from 1976. This is a letter in relation to a particular patient addressed to Dr. Kirk at Trelaws from Dr. Stafford in Plymouth. He refers there to the stocks of haemophil having to maintain at artificially high levels during the holiday season and having a surprising number of transient visitors, and was requesting assistance in terms of stocks from Trelaws for the treatment of that particular patient. And then if we go next in 1978 to CBLA 40822, we can see Dr. Stafford writing to Dr. Tovey, the director of the Bristol Regional Transfusion Centre, on the 31st of July 1978, where he picks up issues about supply in the second sentence. I'm unhappy to have to relate that we are now using the Lister freeze-dried material in excess of income for these 2 patients, and then refers to the 2 patients. It says, I would hesitate to alter back to haemophil for psychological reasons, and we are therefore stuck with using 884 bottles on these 2 patients alone, when our yearly income is 480 bottles in total. And then there's a request for assistance from the Blood Transfusion Centre, and then a suggestion of possibly, in the last paragraph, sending haemophil to Cambridge, to the Cambridge Centre, and asking possibly for a release of Lister stock. There's a response from Dr. Maycock to Dr. Tovey, 11th of August 1978, CBLA 40828. Which refers to Dr. Stafford's request, and says in the second paragraph, I've arranged to increase the Bristol allocation by, looks like 30 bottles and 40 bottles a month on alternate months. I hope that this will be of some help. So we can see there appear to be supply issues in the second half of the 1970s. If we go to Dr. Prentice's witness statement to the inquiry, WITN 5422001, we can pick up what Dr. Prentice was able to recall in relation to the approach to treatment and access to products at page 4. Where he says this, paragraph 16, I do not remember policies being formulated by the Plymouth Haematology Department, and I do not recall us having any. In terms of the selection, purchasing and use of blood products, we went for what was available. We used commercial product as it was often all we could get. I remember constantly trying to find a source of factor VIII and having difficulty with the availability of the supply. I looked for what was the safest product, but I cannot recall any other criteria. Thus, generally, decisions were based on what products we could source. Next paragraph, I do remember discussing the supply of blood and blood products with the South West Centre of the National Blood Service. I cannot remember whether there were discussions with the regional health authority. The regional health authority was a very difficult body to deal with. The decisions to choose one product over another were not decisions as such. It was as a result of availability of product. Commercial and/or financial considerations played no part whatsoever in any sourcing of blood supply. I do not remember giving patients a choice as to which product they would be provided with. I may have asked, but I do not remember. I do not remember if I could even give a choice. As I have already set out, we had to use what we had. If we go to the next page, pick up paragraph 25, he says this: the alternative treatments to factor concentrates available in the 1970s and 80s were cryoprecipitate and DDAVP to the best of my recollection. I always preferred not to give blood or blood product if it could be avoided. I was taught that a pint of blood is a potential biological time bomb. One can never be sure of all consequences, however safe a blood product is made. And then paragraph 27, he talks about cryoprecipitate. An advantage of using cryoprecipitate is that it comes from a single donor and not pooled blood. It is better for von Willebrand patients. The main disadvantage is that there is a variable level of factor VIII concentrate. It is also not treatment which can be used for home treatment. Each case is treated on its own merits, and a record of past responses to blood or blood products is important. If we go over to the page and look at paragraph 31, he says, in relation to the Plymouth Haematology Department's policy and approach in relation to cryoprecipitate, I used cryoprecipitate for moderate and mild haemophilia A and for von Willebrand disease. I tried to stick to that as much as I could. None of us wanted to use pooled products if we could avoid them. Cryoprecipitate is a single donor product. While we are looking at this statement, perhaps we can pick up what Dr. Prentice recalled about knowledge of risk. Again, bearing in mind that he was not at Plymouth in the 1970s, but joined in 1982. If we go to the bottom of page 7, please, Shomik. He says, all I can recall about the relative risks of infection from commercially supplied factor concentrates and NHS factor concentrates is that there was a difference in risk. I believe that UK donors were regular unpaid UK NBS blood donors. In terms of the commercial products, we often did not know the source of that blood supply. Commercial companies were reticent with information. I do recall that in 1968, when travelling in America, I gave blood as a paid donor to fund part of my travel. From the other donors around me at that time, it was clear to me even then that the supply chain could have been contaminated. I often thought about that when people were talking about commercial blood supplies. I definitely asked where commercial blood products were coming from, and there was a general concern amongst colleagues about it. My way of keeping up to date with scientific and medical developments and knowledge was to read the BMJ, the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the British Journal of Haematology. Publication of the American Society of Haematology, Blood, was another publication I regularly read. And then if we look at what he says about hepatitis in the following paragraph, I knew the risk of hepatitis B as I was exposed to it as a senior registrar. A contaminated bag of platelets from a Hep B positive donor had burst and sprayed me whilst I worked at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, Glasgow, in the late 1970s. I had to be tested and was fortunately negative, so I knew about the risk of hepatitis B from early in my career. We all knew that hepatitis B could be fatal. I am not sure when the risks of hepatitis C became known to me, although I'm fairly sure that the severity of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which was later renamed hepatitis C, was not clear until later in the 80s when it did become clear that it could be as bad as hepatitis B. And then, bottom of that page, picking it up in the last three words, the last two lines. For me, reduction in use of blood and blood products was a key factor in reducing risk to patients. Other ways to reduce risk included the use of appropriate products. For severe haemophilia A, we would use factor VIII. For moderate haemophilia A, we would use cryoprecipitate unless it was a severe bleed. And for mild haemophilia A, we used DDAVP or cryoprecipitate. My recollection is that I always managed to get factor VIII for severe bleeds in patients who would have died without it. And then in relation to HIV and AIDS, he says this: my knowledge and understanding, this is in the following two paragraphs, of HIV, HTLV3 and AIDS developed over time as it was written up. I would read about it and discuss it with colleagues. It was an established process of developing knowledge. All of this knowledge was acquired through reading paper journals, there were no online journals, and discussions with colleagues at meetings. I have no specific detail of when I first became, I think there might be a word aware missing, that there might be an association between AIDS and the use of blood products. I cannot recall any specific inquiries carried out by me or within the Plymouth Haematology Department in relation to the risks of transmission of HIV or AIDS. Patients were seen frequently to discuss all aspects of their care, and it is likely that these discussions would have included the risks of viral transmission through the use of blood products, but I cannot recall any such specific discussions. If we pick matters up, then bottom of that page, and paragraph 51, this is a reference to the June 1983 letter from Professor Bloom and Dr. Ritzer, which Dr. Prentice was asked about. I do not recall whether or how I responded to the letter from Professor Bloom and Dr. Ritzer, as I do not actually remember getting the letter. At that point, I was still trying to get homegrown product, and I suspect I was sceptical about the content of the letter. And then he says, paragraph 52, I was sceptical about their comments on hepatitis. One of my colleagues had been sprayed by plasma from a hepatitis B positive patient and became very sick with hepatitis B. He survived it and fortunately cleared the virus. I do not recall that their letter changed my policy and use of blood products, as evidence was evolving at that time, June 1983, and to change policy in the face of uncertainty would have been unwise. In relation to reduction of risk of infection of HIV from factor concentrates, we tried to use homegrown products wherever we could and to limit the concentrate to severe haemophilia A patients or patients with moderate haemophilia A suffering from severe bleeds. In those patients, to not treat would be unacceptable and potentially fatal. We did, at the Plymouth Haematology Department, continue to use factor concentrates to treat patients after we became aware of the possible risks of infection, but only where absolutely necessary. I'm afraid I do not recall when Plymouth Haematology Department began to use heat-treated factor products, and I cannot recall where we started in terms of the categories of patients. We did use it as soon as it was available. So that was Dr. Prentice's recollection. If we turn to look at the annual returns and see what products were used, picking it up in 76, so a number of years before Dr. Prentice arrived, the numbers of patients treated varied from between 8 and 18 haemophilia A patients over the following years, 1 to 5 haemophilia B patients, and up to 3 von Willebrand's patients. The 1976 return for Plymouth is at HCDO 301109. We can see 11 patients treated, 1 patient with factor VIII antibodies, 2 haemophilia B patients treated. And then in terms of products used, we can see that for 1976, the main treatment was with cryoprecipitate, 140,980 units. The second main treatment in terms of volume is the Highland product, Haemophil, 67,440 units. And then the NHS concentrate, 14,000 units, with a very small amount of cryopulin, the immuno product.
And the conversion rate there from cryoprecipitate to units is double that normally used.
Yes, whether that reflects something particular to the way in which cryoprecipitate was supplied by Bristol, I'm afraid I don't know. Maybe that we'll be able to pin that down.
Yes.
If we go then to 1977, HCDO 301195, page 4, we can see again in terms of the product usage, it's still mainly cryoprecipitate, 121,500, but with a closely followed by Haemophil at just under 119,000, and then NHS concentrate, 46,000. If we then turn to 1978, HCDO 0001292, and again, just to get a flavour of the size of the centre, we've got 9 haemophilic patients identified as treated, 1 with factor 8 antibodies, and then 4 haemophilia B patients. We can see here that the main treatment used is NHS concentrate, 164,060 units. That's double the amount used roughly for cryoprecipitate, 82,000, and then a very similar amount being used of the commercial concentrate haemophil, 82,200. In 1979, HCDO 301362 shows a drop in the use of cryoprecipitate, so it's gone from 82,000 to 56,000, nonetheless still in reasonably substantial use. The main product used is still the NHS factor concentrates, that's increased to 194,000, and then there's a slight increase in the volume of haemophil from 82,200 the previous year to a little over 87,000. When we I'll give you the reference for the 1980 return, but the figures are unclear, so I won't put it on the screen. The reference is HCDO 301560. We can see the treatment is cryoprecipitate, NHS concentrate and haemophil, but the precise amounts are unclear. If we then go to 1981, HCDO 000, in fact, I think I've just given you the reference for 1981. The reference for 1980 for the transcript is HCDO 301460, I think. I'll check that, sir. In any event, if we go to 1981, HCDO 301560. What we see here in 1981 is in relation to the treatment of patients with haemophilia A, no cryoprecipitate whatsoever used. So cryoprecipitate is reserved in that year for the treatment of patients with von Willebrand's. And then we can see the only product in substantial use for haemophilia A patients is the NHS concentrate in that year. The figures for units are indistinct, but we can see the figures from the bottles in any event, 217 in hospital, 792 for home treatment. And then there's, for some reason, it's unclear, towards the bottom of the table, there's a suggestion of 354 units for haemophil filled in against the entry for other human factor VIII concentrate, rather than against the entry for haemophil. I'm not quite sure why that's the case. So we see predominantly NHS concentrate then haemophil, but the feature for that year is no cryoprecipitate at all. So I think when we were looking at the 1978 returns, I read a 1 as a 4 in relation to haemophilia B patients. For the benefit of the transcript, it should be 1 haemophilia B patient in 1978, not 4. So that's 19. If we go back to the top of the page, that's 1981, and we can see 9 patients then being treated. If we go to 1982, HCDO 0001755, please. Right, if we look at the top of the page, not sure whether this is 82 or 83. Looks like it's 83, although there seems to be a scroll over it. In any event, we can pick up the picture then as at 1983, if that's the correct year, which I'll check. We can see again, in any event, no cryoprecipitate whatsoever used for the treatment of haemophilia A patients. We don't even have the number of patients treated during that year completed on this form. And then we can see NHS concentrate used to a considerable extent, 104,500 units in hospital, 373,750 units for home treatment. The next largest in terms of volume is the use of haemophil. It looks like 15,500 units in hospital, and then I think it's 38,000 or so, 152 bottles in any event used for home treatment, and then a small amount of the Armour product, factor 8. And then if we go then to um, 1984, HCDO, no, I'm sorry, 301944 is the reference I've got, but I think that's for 1985. So I think we have some returns potentially missing here. Yes, this is 1985. We've got 9 patients treated for haemophilia A. Again, no cryoprecipitate in use other than for von Willebrand's patients. And then we've got NHS concentrate being used. And then now the Armour factor 8 product. What this doesn't, I think, tell us is a return is the extent to which that's unheated or heat-treated material. Can we try Shemik HCDO 301849? No, we don't have that. I don't think we have the 1984 return to display, but in any event, I can come back to that tomorrow if need be. So that's the pattern, sir, in relation to usage in Plymouth. We see the dropping off of cryoprecipitate over the latter part of the 1970s and the increased use of NHS concentrates and then substantial use of usually a single commercial concentrate haemophil. If I deal then with questions of hepatitis C infection, and if we look at TSFT 602_025, you'll recall Dr. Prentice from his statement was unclear as to his developing knowledge of risk in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis. There's little by way of contemporaneous documentation to assist us with the understanding of his predecessors. So again, it may be a question of what inferences can be drawn from available medical literature and UK HCDO minutes. This gives us some information rather later in the time period about hepatitis C and the way in which hepatitis C was now being managed by the mid-1990s in Plymouth. So this is a letter from a consultant haematologist, Dr. Copplestone, 8th of July 1996. I enclose the hepatitis C audit sheets. It's been a useful activity getting out these patients. There is a little uncertainty about the original number of patients who've received concentrate factor, and it may be more than 16. I'm trying to sort out our Oxford haemophilia database. Our basic policy is to manage these patients in collaboration with Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, our hepatologist. His policy so far has been to monitor the liver function tests and ask me to arrange PCR tests which have been performed at Edinburgh. Many of the patients are currently being reviewed by him in the light of the results to make a decision about alpha interferon treatment. And then next paragraph says, I've also been sent an alpha interferon and ribavirin trial to consider. There are only a few patients that would be eligible here because of the age criteria. So we don't, I'm afraid, have a copy of the audit sheets themselves to fill in the detail, but that gives us some indication as to how later on those who had been infected with hepatitis C were being monitored and managed in Plymouth. In terms of information from individual patients or their families, you have received evidence there of a patient being tested for hepatitis C without their knowledge and being notified of their hepatitis C infection in 1994, despite the fact that the test was undertaken in 1992. So again, a picture of delay in patients being told diagnosis, which you've heard of in relation to other centres as well. In relation to HIV, again, there's little by way of contemporaneous documentation. So other than Dr. Prentice's recollection in his statement, the information we have about the numbers infected from UK HCDO suggested 6 patients with HIV. If we just look perhaps at INQY 0000250, We go to the next page. We can see Plymouth is centre 15. It's halfway down the page. And this table, which, as I explained earlier, is being compiled from data provided by UK HCDO, indicates... Sorry, can we see the whole page, Shemik, because we need to see the dates? Thank you. So in relation to Plymouth, we've got 1 patient identified in 1984, 4 in 1985, and 1 in 1988, giving a total of 6. Dr. Prentice's recollection in his statement was that he told people of their diagnosis with HIV face to face. The last document we have in relation to information about HIV concerns a patient found to be HIV positive in 1988. And I'll just show you that for the sake of completeness. CBLA 302420. CBLA 0002420. So this is a letter sent again by Dr. Copplestone, consultant haematologist in Plymouth, to Dr. Ritzer at Oxford, September 1988. It says in the second paragraph, as I mentioned, we had 1 further patient who has been found to be HIV antibody positive on the 19th of May 1988. It was thought that he was tested in 1985 and was HIV antibody, and then there's a word missing, but the sense of the letter would suggest that the missing word is negative at this time. But I cannot find any report in his notes or in the microbiology lab relating to this test. Since 1985, he's had the following blood products, and then we see a list of ARMA products and NHS products and the dates of treatment. We have no more information about this particular patient, but an inference may be, given the dates, that this was a case of...
Can we just go back to the top of this letter? There is a year of birth. That's somebody else.
That's a different patient.
A different patient,
That's a
right?
different patient.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first paragraph's dealing with somebody else. The second paragraph is dealing with this discovery of a patient being HIV positive in 1988. And one inference you might draw is this is a case of infection through the ARMA heated product.
Yes.
There's a possibility. I haven't double-checked anything in relation to the batch numbers, but we know, of course, that some heated factor VIII products nonetheless led to seroconversions.
Yes, of course, the early product in early 1985 might not have been.
It might not have been heated, no. Heat treated. And certainly in relation to the NHS product, treatment in January 1985 may be unlikely to have been heat treated.
One would suspect. The difficulty is knowing whether the ARMA heat treated product was available.
So that's the position in relation to Plymouth. Before I then turn to the next South West England Centre, can I then go back to the issue in relation to Lewisham? Thank you, Shemik. So this is a document from September 1970. I'm grateful to the representatives of the Haemophilia Society for drawing this to our attention. For the transcript, it's HSOC 00227939. If we can turn to page 5, and it's just further information about the use of cryoprecipitate for home treatment in Lewisham. We pick it up in the second paragraph. We can see this is concerning the Lewisham group. And then it says this: the value to a severe haemophiliac of a deep freeze, provided there is a sufficient supply of cryoprecipitate available for storage, has been highlighted in the case of that supplied by the group to one of our young members. In addition to having already saved this patient a considerable number of journeys to hospital for treatment, it recently enabled him to return home the same day after dental extraction, instead of having to occupy a hospital bed for 10 to 14 days, as is often usual in such circumstances. In this case, he was simply supplied with sufficient cryoprecipitate to store at home, and his own GP, with the treatment at hand, was able quite adequately and successfully to take over the care of the patient during the post-extraction period. Another important benefit reported is that during the 3 months the deep freeze has made possible treatment for his bleeds at home, it has also given the patient the advantage of an additional 3 weeks attendance at school as compared with the previous 3 months. This represents a very valuable and significant increase of no less than 25% to his schooling. The deep freeze was supplied to the member with the cooperation of one of the most active haemophilia centres in the UK, Lewisham Hospital. And then there's an extract from a letter written by Dr. Whitmore at the Lewisham Hospital. It's not dealing specifically with the question of home treatment, it's dealing with the importance of trying to avoid bleeds, so I'm not proposing to read that out. But that adds to the picture of use of cryoprecipitate home treatment at Lewisham as early there as 1970. Turning then to Exeter. Exeter was centre number 14, based at the Royal Devon and Exeter Hospital. Dr. Edgecombe was the centre director until 1985. His successor, Dr. Lee, describes Dr. Edgecombe as a laboratory haematologist, one of the last in his era. Dr. Lee took over in February 1985 and remained centre director and consultant haematologist until June 2010. And we have a witness statement from Dr. Lee. The reference, we don't need to display it at the moment, is WITN 4408007. Exeter also received its supplies from the South West Regional Transfusion Centre in Bristol, although there are some documents which show some individual arrangements for the receipt of supplies from Oxford. In terms of facilities, Dr. Lee's recollection is that when he took up his post in early 1985, patients with bleeding disorders were scattered throughout the hospital in various medical wards. He describes children with haemophilia being managed in paediatrics, with Dr. Edgecombe advising on treatment products and on testing. And he goes on to explain how he and a colleague, Dr. Joyner, established a dedicated haematology ward for the treatment of patients with haemophilia, as well as patients with other blood disorders. If we then look at some documents from the early 70s in relation to treatment preferences, we start with BPLL 000811. This is the response to Dr. Maycock's questionnaire, and the response from Dr. Edgecombe of the Exeter Centre is at page 10. We can see he records regular treatment of 23 patients with haemophilia, and then in terms of his preference for products, he answers yes to question 2B. So his preference is for the use of freeze-dried concentrate in the treatment of his patients. If we go then next to OXUH 40642, we will see what's obviously a response to a letter from Dr. Edgecombe, from Dr. Maycock at Elstree. It's June 1974. He says in the second paragraph, home treatment presents many problems, mainly for the reason that we cannot at present make anything like enough concentrate to meet all needs. To provide it for home treatment, therefore, always entails most difficult decisions. And so far, BPL has not specifically issued any concentrate for use in this way. The policy has been to retain the concentrate at BPL and to issue it for use in those major elective operations and in emergencies for which cryoprecipitate is inadequate. All the concentrate we prepare is used in this manner. I hope you will appreciate the difficulty in which I find myself. If I send you concentrate for the two families, I shall soon receive similar requests from many other quarters, which I will not be able to meet, and the supply of concentrates for emergencies and operations will be jeopardised. I would therefore prefer not to issue concentrate. I think we can infer from this that Dr. Edgecombe had written to Dr. Maycock asking if he could have a supply of concentrate to establish a home treatment programme for two families. And that's the response he got. we do see from later documents that in 1976 there's a patient from Exeter on a regular home treatment therapy, and we've also got witness evidence describing home treatment through the Exeter Centre from individuals. In terms of the numbers of patients treated at the centre, they vary according to the annual returns from 76 onwards to between 17 and 25 haemophilia A patients. If we start by looking at the 1976 forms, HCDO 5041_002, page 4, we can see 19 patients with haemophilia treated in the year. Not quite sure what the figure was for haemophilia B, but we can see in any event all haemophilia B treatment was with NHS factor 9 concentrate. In terms of haemophilia A, we see cryoprecipitate used, 58,000 plus, but the main treatment being used there is cryobulin, so commercial concentrate as early as 1976 was the predominant treatment, followed by cryoprecipitate and then haemophil. No NHS concentrates at all used in the course of 1976. 1977, however, shows a different picture, HCDO 301158. We can see a small amount of cryoprecipitate in use, so a very significant decline in the use of cryoprecipitate, down to 5,700. But NHS concentrates available, and the largest single form of therapeutic material used, so 82,130. But also a substantial quantity of cryobulin, 51,500 approximately, and just over 38,000 units of haemophil. So the treatment seems to have shifted to being concentrate-based, essentially split between NHS and commercial concentrates. That, I think, is then the pattern largely established. If we look at HCDO 0001256, for example, which is 1978, we can see no cryoprecipitate. The major product used, NHS concentrates, just over 100,000, but roughly 90,000 of commercial concentrates, most of which is cryobulin, with 12,000 odd units of haemophil. When we get to 1979, HCDO 301323, we'll see the dominant product is commercial. So cryobulin, nearly 210,000 units, compared with 153,820 units of NHS concentrate, and then just over 10,000 units of haemophil, and still cryoprecipitate not in apparent use at all. And then if we move to HCDO 301420, this is 1980. Again, no cryoprecipitate, not even, in fact, for the treatment of patients with von Willebrand's, who were treated with NHS concentrate and with haemophil and cryobulin. For the haemophilia A patients, by far and away, the main treatment is with the immunoproduct with cryobulin. So 106,500 or so units in hospital, nearly 237,407 units home treatment, contrasting with NHS concentrates, 55,000 plus hospital and just over 49,000 home treatment, and then haemophil in third place, as it were, with approximately 47,000 units used. 1981 then, HCDO 301518, shows proportionately an increase in the amount of NHS concentrate used. So again, no cryoprecipitate at all, whether for haemophilia A patients or von Willebrand's patients. There seems to be, if we just stick with von Willebrand's for present purposes, a substantial volume of haemophil used for the home treatment of von Willebrand's patients, 85,000 units there recorded. In terms of treatment of haemophilia A patients, the product most in use is the NHS concentrate, over 200,000 units in total, followed by haemophil, 82,500 approximately at home and hospital, and then cryobulin, a little over 55,000 for home treatment and just under 2,000 for hospital treatment. And then if we look at HCDO 301619, this now is 1982. We can see there, again, no cryoprecipitate at all. NHS concentrate is the main product used, but a substantial volume of haemophil also in use, and then a smaller volume of cryobulin. When we move to 1983, HCDO 301716, we'll see a third commercial concentrate being introduced. So we now have factor 8 used to a very substantial extent indeed. So it's the main product used. 74,645 units in hospital, 326,745 units for home treatment. So that's the main product. Then NHS concentrates. We see the figures there in relation to home treatment, 317,000 plus. And then smaller volumes of both haemophil and cryobulin in use. And then lastly, 1984, HCDO 301811. We will see from that that the factor 8 product, the armour product, is still the product in greatest use overall. 68,235 hospital, 264,225 units home, followed by NHS concentrates, which are used, again, to a substantial extent, and then a very small use of cryobulin. So that's what we see from the annual returns. Dr. Lee said in his statement that he took a decision soon after commencing in post in February 1985 to use heat-treated products, reflecting the advice that had been given by reference centre directors at their meeting in December 1984. I don't need to take you to it, but we can see that in February 1985, soon after taking up his post, he wrote to Dr. Snape asking for supplies of heat-treated concentrates. In relation to the question of product choice and the provision of information to patients, Dr. Lee can obviously really only speak to the period after he began at the centre, but he says this in his statement: on the whole, patients were not offered a choice because supplies could not be guaranteed. They were informed of the risks and benefits and generally accepted what was available. He also says it was his practice to be open and provide as much information as patients wished. He says he would have explained that NHS products and heat-treated concentrates were probably safer than commercial and non-heat-treated concentrates, and that there were alternatives that could be considered in some but not all circumstances, such as cryoprecipitate and DDAVP. But as I say, that of course relates to the period when he took up his post, which is early 1985 onwards. In terms of knowledge of risk, Dr. Edgecombe, I think, was an occasional attender at Haemophilia Centre Director meetings, and there is correspondence showing, for example, the submission of forms to Oxford in relation to the hepatitis surveys that we know were undertaken on an ongoing basis. Dr. Edgecombe specifically attended the September 1982 Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting, at which we know the question of age was first discussed. If we then look at LHBT 009876_019, you'll see a letter from Dr. Edgecombe to the Bristol Regional Transfusion Centre. It's dated the 10th of November 1983. We don't need to look at the first 3 paragraphs, but if we look at the 4th, it says this. At the meeting of Haemophilia Centre directors on October the 17th, Geoffrey Scott said that the haemophiliacs of Bristol were now refusing to make any use of American factor VIII concentrate, and I wondered where this left the rest of the region. Can you get enough Lister supplies for all our needs? If not, it seems rather unfair that one centre can hand it out and another not. So we can see from this that Dr. Edgecombe was present at the meeting in October 1983 of the Haemophilia Centre directors and heard what was being said by Dr. Scott, who you'll recall was the centre director in Bristol. The response to this letter is that NHBT 00987560_017 Dr. Fraser wrote on the 17th of November 1983, and the relevant part of his response starts at the bottom of the 2nd page. Under the heading Factor VIII, Dr. Fraser says this, I spoke to Dr. Scott today regarding your letter, and he confirms that some of his patients are refusing American Factor VIII. He is stopping all planned surgery for his patients for the time being. Dr. Scott has not asked for, and we have not given him, an increased allocation of BPL Factor VIII so that his patients can only be treated with this product. We are not giving any preferential treatment with regard to BPL Factor VIII supply to any centre in the southwest region. Top of the next page. We cannot attain self-sufficiency for the BPL Factor VIII to supply the total requirements of all haemophilia treatment centres in this region until we send sufficient plasma to the blood products laboratory for fractionation. I'm attempting to send as much as possible in 1983. And then he goes on to talk about ways in which he is attempting to achieve that. Dr. Lee has in his statement set out his understanding of the knowledge of HIV. He talks about being aware of HIV and AIDS as a risk of blood transfusions when the first reports of the disease in haemophiliacs in the USA were published. He thinks in around 1983 or 1984. And then he sets out his belief that Dr. Edgecombe made patients aware of the dilemma of either using concentrates that might expose them to a risk of infection or having to use less effective alternatives. The description less effective comes from Dr. Lee's statement rather than being my own description. If we then look at what Dr. Lee recalls about how patients were told about their HIV diagnosis, if we can have his statement on screen, please, Shomik. It's WYTN 4408007. And it's paragraph 28, which is page 13. If we pick it up in the second line, he says, my memory of the steps I took at Exeter are clearer. On the first day in my post, I was confronted with a file on the desk marked high priority, left by Dr. Edgecombe, with a note that the enclosed results of HIV tests from about 12 or 14 haemophilia patients needed urgent attention. The results of these tests done in the previous weeks had just returned in the days before his retirement, and he felt it would be more appropriate for me to deal with them. It was a baptism of fire that still haunts me today. I contacted the patients and saw them individually in clinic. I introduced myself as the new consultant and gently broke the news of their blood test results. Initial reactions varied from shock and silence to anger and hostility. And then his recollection was that none elected to revert to cryoprecipitate, in particular those on home treatment. But then he goes on to explain that by February 1985, which was when he took up his post, heat-treated NHS Factor VIII was just being introduced. You do have an account, so I'll just give you the witness reference rather than go to the statement itself, but from a witness whose husband was informed of his HDLV3 infection at the Exeter Centre in 1985 at WITN 1589001. We don't need to go to it, but she recalls her husband being told he might have 2 or 3 years left to live, and her recollection that no real information or advice was provided to them regarding the infection or how to manage it, or risks other than the wearing of condoms. Dr. Lee, in his statement, explains that there were no dedicated support services available within the hospital, and such services as were available, he says, were overstretched and waiting times were very long. He says in his statement that specialist HIV care was not available in Exeter until around 2000. And prior to that, patients would be seen by a general physician or respiratory physician with management from haematology depending on the nature of the presenting complaint. In terms of hepatitis C, Dr. Lee's recollection was that the monitoring of liver function as an indicator of non-A, non-B hepatitis was in place when he came to the Exeter Centre in 1985. And he recalls testing for hepatitis C beginning in the early 1990s when a test became available. Dr. Lee's recollection was 2 or 3 patients being infected with hepatitis C, but that was a recollection, I think, only. There is no documentation that provides any further light on that. His recollection, too, was that liver specialist care wasn't available until around 2000. So I'm then going to come to Taunton and Yeovil. So the centre at Taunton and Yeovil provided care from Musgrove Park Hospital's clinical pathology department in Taunton, but with some haemophiliac patients also being seen at the clinical pathology department in Yeovil. And it was identified as formally as a centre in 1976. Care of haemophilia seems to have been shared between Dr. Johnson and Dr. Phillips. Dr. Phillips' name appears on the 1976 returns onwards, and he's noted as attending the UK HCDO meeting in 1977. And then Dr. Simon Davis became the centre director in 1995, retired at the beginning of this year, and he has provided a statement to the inquiry dealing with that latter period. I'm not proposing to take you to it now, but it's WITN 5590001. There is also reference within the materials, and indeed Dr. Davis's statement, to the work of Dr. Elizabeth Thompson at the centre. Dr. Davis says she effectively ran the day-to-day haemophilia centre and saw most of the outpatients with bleeding disorders, including at that stage a significant number of children. And indeed she's listed, I think, as a director on some annual returns in 1987 or so onwards. We have an account of haemophilia care in Taunton at TSFT 602_002. This is in 1987, and it's Dr. Phillips, consultant haematologist at Taunton, writing to Dr. Lee, the consultant at Exeter, whose evidence I referred to only a few minutes ago. This was on an issue about the reorganisation of haemophilia care in the UK, and in particular in the southwest. I'm just going to show you a little in the second paragraph, which provides some background and context in relation to the work of the centre in Taunton. So picking it up, if we just go slightly further up the page, please show me. Picking it up in the second sentence of the second paragraph, as I know you are of the same mind, I find it extremely galling even to consider a change in direction, especially in view of the fact that we here, and I include Steve Johnson and Elizabeth Thompson, have worked extremely hard to build up a flourishing coagulation unit. Judged by the criteria which you mention, it may well be that we would lose our recognition as a centre because we only have 8 haemophiliacs who require regular treatment or who are indulging in home therapy. Occasionally one would reach the 10 mark by visitors either from overseas or who are attending Minehead holiday camps, because I believe that the Haemophilia Association does arrange bookings there. And then he goes on to deal with von Willebrands and patients having 3 factor VIII inhibitor cases. And then if we go to the next paragraph, second sentence, at the moment I do get a special budget allowance. Indeed, our staff nurse was appointed to help with the coagulation clinic work. I'm sure that in the present financial climate it would be only too easy for management to remove such support if we were no longer recognised as a centre. But at the same time, of course, the patients would be there. I cannot see where my patients would go if they did not come here, especially in view of distances involved. As you know, Somerset is a very rural county, and some of the patients have to come some 40 miles to their treatment. To add another 40 miles to Exeter or 52 miles to Bristol would be, I feel, untenable. And then, bottom of the page, he says he believes that the Taunton Centre does what it's supposed to. It says this. So, very bottom of the page, please show me. No, in fact, we can pick it up top of the next page. My apologies. He says there is, like Exeter, always a consultant on call, and usually all emergency admission for coagulation disorders are seen by a consultant. So that gives us a flavour, sir, of the size of the Taunton Centre in the 80s and of its facilities in terms of both consultant and nursing staff. Dr. Davis describes the care provided at the centre upon his arrival in 1995 as follows. He says, most of the medical elements of haemophilia care were delivered by an associate specialist in haematology, Dr. Elizabeth Thompson. Approximately 50% of her role was dedicated to haemophilia and related blood disorders. And then he refers to there being a weekly clinic and an experienced nursing sister who also ran the haematology day care unit, and evidence of excellent collaboration with specialist medical colleagues in paediatrics, orthopaedics, gastroenterology, HIV medicine, etc. But again, that's a picture from the 1990s onwards. In terms of the numbers of patients treated, they're relatively small. So the annual return in 1976 records 5 haemophilia A patients, 1 haemophilia B, and 1 patient with von Willebrand's disease. The only treatment given in 1976 was cryoprecipitate and then factor IX, the haemophilia B patient. If we then pick it up in 1977 at HCDO 301210, page 3, we can get a sense of the size of the centre there, 9 patients treated during that year, and then 2 haemophilia B patients. And then in terms of the products used, cryoprecipitate is the product in greatest use, 42,200 units, followed by NHS concentrate, 21,400, and then a single commercial concentrate, Haemophil, just under 15,000 units in use. We don't have the annual return for 1978. 1979 shows a change in terms of both use of commercial concentrate and cessation of use of cryoprecipitate. We go to HCDO 301378. We'll see no cryoprecipitate at all in relation to haemophilia A. And then the main product in use is the commercial concentrate from Highland, the Haemophil product, 142,542. And then broadly similar amounts of NHS concentrate, just over 31,000, and Coate, the Cutter's product, just over 33,000 in use, with a tiny amount of Cryoprecipitate used. So commercial concentrates dominating in 1979. The picture in 1980 is similar, HCDO 301476. no cryoprecipitate again, the product in greatest use being Haemophilia, and then smaller amounts of NHS concentrate, of coate, and of cryoprecipitate in use. Sorry, that's for home treatment. I should say in relation to hospital treatment, the figure in relation to NHS concentrate, 19,428, so that takes it up slightly. But still, the overwhelming picture is Haemophilia being the main product in use, both for the purposes of hospital treatment and for the purposes of home treatment. The following year, HCDO 301580 is 1981. Again, no cryoprecipitate in use at all except for von Willebrand's patients. The picture here is slightly different in the sense that there is a greater use of NHS concentrates, so just under 140,000 in hospital and just over 99,000 for home treatment. So that's now the main treatment in use, followed by Haemophilia, used to a very similar extent for home treatment, and then just under 70,000 units used for hospital treatment. And then we can see factor VIII being used, again, to a fairly considerable extent, and then small volumes of coate and cryoprecipitate. HCDO 301675 gives us the picture for 1982. So again, cryoprecipitate is only in use for von Willebrand's patients. The product in greatest use is NHS concentrate, both hospital and home, followed now by coate, and then a smaller volume of factor VIII being used and a much smaller volume of cryoprecipitate being used. Two final returns. If we look at the return for 1983, which is HCDO 301772. We can see that for Haemophilia A patients, only two products in use, NHS concentrate and the coate. The product in greatest use now by quite a considerable margin are NHS concentrates. But coate is still being used very substantially, in particular for home treatment. Cryoprecipitate features only for the treatment of patients with von Willebrand's. And then finally, in terms of the returns for Taunton, 1984, HCDO 301865. It's a tiny amount of cryoprecipitate identified for use in hospital, and then more widely for the treatment of the von Willebrand's patients. The main product in use is, again, NHS concentrate, but we can see that coate also being used for home treatment to a very substantial extent, 227,000 units odd, compared to NHS concentrate used for home treatment, 248,500 units. It will probably only take me 5 minutes to complete Taunton, so
yes, go ahead.
if you're happy to do that, I'll continue. So that's project usage. There is no real direct information about awareness of risk of viral infection, whether hepatitis or HIV. There are some communications in terms of completion of chronic hepatitis surveys submitted to Oxford, and some communications, for example, with Trelaws about individual patients. In terms of hepatitis C testing, there's some evidence to suggest that the centre began testing in the early 1990s. Dr. Davis's statement explains that by the time he joined the centre in 1995, a thorough programme of testing had been instituted. He recalls informing one patient of their diagnosis of hepatitis C after he arrived. In terms of HIV, HTLV3, again, an absence of contemporaneous documentation. Dr. Thompson and Dr. Phillips, however, both attended the October 83 UK HCDO meeting. And again, it may be reasonable to assume they'd have received minutes of meetings in earlier years. There is, if we look at TREL 40276_140, evidence of Taunton being given information about Treloar's AIDS-related investigations. So this is a letter 28th of June 1983 from Dr. Wassef at Treloar's to Dr. Thompson. And if we go to the bottom of the page, we can see there the reference to AIDS-related investigations and examination for the stigmata of AIDS. And we've seen those kind of investigations in a number of Treloar's letters. But here we can see a communication with Taunton in June 1983 about that issue. In terms of how patients receive their diagnosis, nothing by way of contemporaneous material. You do have an account, sir, from an individual who describes receiving his diagnosis in April 1985. His account is Dr. Thompson told him that he'd been tested, they'd found HTLV3 antibodies in my blood, and at that point I was the only one in Taunton Hospital who'd been infected. She said she did not know what it meant and that it could be I was infected with the AIDS virus, that I was immune to the AIDS virus, or that nothing might happen. In terms of figures, the data that we have from UKHCDO, if we go to INQY 40250, please, we pick up the entry for Taunton on page 2. Taunton is centre 16, and if we read across, we see a figure of 3 patients in 1985 testing for positive for HIV. And then if we go across, we see a further patient. It says missing year, so they don't know what year that is, but giving a total of 4 cases. We also, if we go to TSFT 601_030, TSFT 601_030. This is in relation to Centre 16, so in relation to the Taunton and Yeovil Centre. The document is not dated, I'm afraid, but we can see it seems to set out numbers of HIV-positive patients as at 1989 and 1990, so 3, 1989 to 1990, and then it gives figures for numbers of HIV-negative patients in the next column. That, of course, doesn't necessarily reflect patients infected through their treatment at the centre. It may be patients who had moved and come under the care of the centre. So that's the material, again, by way of summary in relation to the centre for Taunton and Yeovil. And perhaps a convenient moment now to take a break.
Yes. Well, we'll take a break until 10 to 4.
Thank you.